for being here. Today we have the pleasure of having Steve, who is a physicist by training as well. We have a physicist here with us in the in the audience. And yeah, so Steve earned his PhD in physics from UC Berkeley in 2012. He continued as a physicist in academia and industry, and in 2019 he started researching AGI safety and alignment in his free time, his hobby, and then from that hobby became a full-time job in 2021, first on a grant and as a research fellow at the Astra Institute. As usual, if you have any questions, you can ask me during the talk, and also we're gonna have 15 or 10 minutes towards the end for the questions. So yeah, without further ado, I will let you have the mic, Steve. The floor is yours.
Okay, I will share my screen, if that works. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. Great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This is going to be based on intro to brain-like AGI safety, series of blog posts on the alignment forum. You can Google search for that. The URL is easy to remember as well. Capital H, lowercase z, c. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Yeah, and I live in Boston, but I work for Astera Institute, which is this foundation based in California. Yeah, let's jump right into general motivation. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence. I don't know, this might be old hat to some of you, but just to make sure we're on the same page, I'll talk. Yeah, let's. Here's a few words about how I think about AGI and what I'm working on, the problem that I'm trying to solve. So AI, as we think of it today, we're usually imagining, a tool that humans use. Future AGI that I'm concerned about, it would be best to imagine it as an agent or a team of agents that can figure things out and get stuff done and make plans. And if the plans don't work, then they come up with another solution, or they go gather more resources that can do creative problem solving and autonomously invent new science and technology. All the things that humans and teams of humans and societies of humans can do, these AGIs would be able to do as well. Oops. Another thing is humans can pilot any arbitrary teleoperated robot after an hour or two of practice pretty well. I expect AGIs would be able to do that too. You don't have to do a research project and breed a new type of human when they get a new type of robot. They just figure it out. Likewise, I expect AGIs to be able to figure things out in the same way. So yeah, AI as we think about it today is normal sounding discourse. The future AGI I'm concerned about sounds like crazy sci-fi stuff. I like to think of it as a new intelligent species on our planet, and one which will eventually vastly outnumber us, think faster, and be more experienced, competent, creative, and so on. Lots of things sound like crazy sci-fi stuff and then happen anyway. Heavier than air flight sounded like crazy sci-fi stuff in 1800, but it still happened. In fact, if you're imagining the future and it doesn't contain any crazy sci-fi stuff whatsoever, then you should be suspicious that you're omitting something important. And then finally, AI as we think of it today, we're worried about bad actors and war and inequality, lots of other things like that. The future AGI I'm worried about, we still have to worry about all those things, but we also need to worry about the AGIs themselves being bad actors, probably accidentally. People could do that. They could also do it on purpose. So this is sort of the context. Yeah, so bad actor that can instantly make copies of itself and so on. This is the context where people start worrying about human extinction, and I worry about that too. So let's try to make that less likely. And this is the area where I specifically work in. that I call brain-like AGI safety. So it's this scenario that says maybe future researchers will reverse engineer or perhaps reinvent algorithms that are similar to those that power the human brain. So again, humans can, do all those things mentioned in the previous slide, invent science and engineering, found and run companies. So there's something in their brain that allows them to do all those things. And AIs could do the same thing via the same kinds of algorithms. And this is for better or worse. I'm not endorsing this as a good plan, but rather a scenario that we should be planning for. So if this happens, then how do we get to safe and beneficial AGI? That's the research area that I work in. So why am I working in that area? I'll start with the sort of diplomatic justification for that. And that says, from where we are right now, we don't have AGIs that can autonomously invent science and engineering, that can autonomously found and run companies. It's a future technology, and we don't yet know how it's going to work algorithmically. So we should be contingency planning for any algorithm that seems plausible. And surely something similar to the human brain algorithm at least passes the bar of being a plausible scenario. In other words, if we imagine this giant universe of all algorithms that seem like they might lead to AGI, as far as we know right now, we have foundation models over in this corner, and in theory, you could emulate animal evolution. You might need to boil the ocean with how much compute that requires, but in theory, you could get AGI that way too. I'm working down in the model-based reinforcement learning corner, the same corner that includes mu0, HGPA architecture that Jan LeCun works on. I think that the algorithms powering the human brain are in that box for reasons that I'll get to later in the talk. But they're different from any model-based RL algorithm that currently exists on arXiv. So I just got back from an AGI safety and alignment conference and definitely felt like the guy on the right. But just to be clear, I think that, given the scale and scope of the problem, we should have people working on all of these different scenarios much more than is currently the case. Okay, and then I have my less diplomatic justification, which says I am expecting that foundation models will plateau before they get very powerful and dangerous. And I'm not going to defend that in this talk. I like to say we'll find out sooner or later, given the way people seem to be talking these days, Dario Amodei and so on. I think we'll find out quite soon if they are right or not. So yeah, why waste our time arguing about it? One intuition that I like to offer is that sometimes there's kind of one best algorithm for some task. For example, if you want to do a Fourier transform then of a big data set, then you should use FFT. It's been independently reinvented multiple times. If we ever met aliens, I would expect them to be using some variant of FFT as well. So maybe that should at least raise a possibility that maybe brains are kind of, by the same token, the one best algorithm for figuring things out in the real world and getting things done. So that's not like a strong argument. It's just trying to raise that as a possibility. Anyway, I, for one, am expecting brain-like AGI. But to be clear, this doesn't necessarily imply long timelines to AGI by any reasonable standard. So for example, I like to bring up the fact that deep learning was a backwater just 13 years ago. That's how long AlexNet, that's when AlexNet happened. LLMs didn't exist 7 years ago. So yeah, what paradigm is a backwater doesn't even exist today, but could be subject to however many billions of dollars of investment. Everybody in the world knows all about it, in 5 years and 10 years. That's a thing that can happen. So we might have a long time till brain-like AGI, but we also shouldn't rule out that it's something that could happen relatively soon. Not as soon as next year, like Dario Amodei is talking about, but soon, as in 2030, 2030s. Okay, so that was the introduction, and I'll move on to a very big picture of brain algorithms. So the whole idea of brain-like AGI is that the brain it's a tractable research program because we know something about these algorithms that we're trying to prepare for because we have brains. So in particular, this requires that we know enough about brain algorithms to say any useful things at all about this hypothetical future brain-like AGI. So I do sometimes get pushback to this claim by people who say, no, 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 the brain is obscenely, ridiculously complicated. We have not made any progress, and we're still many centuries, if not millennia, away from understanding it. People joke about this. I joke about it too. This is me joking about it. But what I really believe is that brain complexity, as it pertains to AGI, is very easy to overstate and very often overstated. And the basic reason is that understanding the brain well enough to make brain-like AGI is a different and much simpler task than just understanding the brain. So if neuroscientists see understanding the brain as their goal, they'll say, well, yeah, of course, it's really complicated. But that's not the bar that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about this much easier task. So there's a few reasons for that. The first reason is that learning algorithms are much simpler than the trained models that they create. So probably many of you in the room can train a convolutional neural net and understand how that works. But probably nobody in this room and nobody in the world can take the 100 million parameters of a trained convolutional neural net and explain exactly step by step how it classifies a fish. These giant lists of numbers in the trained weights. So by the same token, if you look at an adult human and you ask a cognitive science question like, how does the adult human do such and such task? That's at least partly a question about the adult human's trained models. They've been thinking and learning and trying things out for a billion seconds of their life, and they've wound up with all of these learned habits and learned models and learned everything that's informing their behavior as an adult. I think that just like we already can train ConvNets, by the same token, we'll be building brain-like AGI long before we can answer those kinds of cognitive science questions. So then another reason that brain complexity is very easy to overstate is that algorithms in general are much simpler than their physical instantiations. So again, many of you in the room can probably train a ConvNet, but few, if any of you, can explain top to bottom, starting from the laws of physics, how your physical chip is implementing that learning algorithm, which includes everything from integrated circuit physics and engineering to CUDA compilers, on and on. So by the same token, if you look at the brain, you don't just see the algorithm, you see the physical implementation. And if you zoom in on any neuron, then you can see this fractal-like complexity of complex mechanisms. And the more you zoom, the more complexity you find. But I think that people will be building brain-like AGI long before we have reverse engineered all these gory details of protein cascades and everything else about molecular biology in the context of neuroscience. And then last but not least, the parts of the brain algorithm that are necessary for general intelligence is much simpler than the entire brain algorithm. Here's a picture of a guy with no cerebellum who is happily holding down a job. People are born with, missing an entire cerebral cortex hemisphere. There's some little bit of the brainstem that is wired up in such a way that it encodes this motor program that the right way to vomit, if you're a human, is to contract such and such muscles in such and such order and release certain hormones and so on and so forth. Nobody needs to reverse engineer or reinvent those parts of the brain in order to make brain-like AGI. Okay, so hopefully we're feeling a little more like we have a can-do attitude about understanding the brain now, or at least understanding the brain well enough to make progress on this research program. And to move forward, one of the key concepts that I go back to all the time when I talk about the brain is learning from scratch. So here's two examples of things that are learning from scratch, and then I'll say what they have in common. So the first example is any machine learning algorithm whatsoever that's initialized from random weights. And the second example is a blank flash drive that you just bought from the store, and the bits are all random, or they're all zeros, or whatever it is. So what do these have in common? They initially can only emit signals that are random garbage or otherwise useless. But over time, they can emit more and more useful signals thanks to a learning algorithm that adjusts some memory store inside them. So in the case of an ML algorithm, again, let's say a convolutional neural net image classifier, all of its labels are going to be random garbage when you first turn it on, but gradient descent updates the weights, and then it winds up doing all this cool, useful image classifications for us. And likewise, a blank flash drive is very useful, but you can't pull any information off of it until after you've already written information onto it. So it's sort of a memory system in a very broad sense. And my hypothesis is that more than 90% of the human brain learns from scratch in this sense, including the whole cortex, the neocortex, the hippocampus, the striatum, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, the cerebellum. But the big exceptions are the hypothalamus and the brainstem. So that's this little bit at the bottom near the spine, basically. So that's a hypothesis. Should we believe it? Well, I believe it. My take is that there's actually a lot of strong evidence in favor of this hypothesis. And you can see my blog post, Learning from Scratch in the Brain, for that whole discussion. I find that a few neuroscientists agree with me. And if you disagree, it does seem like the vast majority have never considered that hypothesis in the first place. So, for example, horses can walk within an hour of birth. That's pretty cool. So here's two theories that could explain that. The first says that the horse brain has learning algorithms, and the learning algorithms are pre-trained by evolution. And then a different theory is the horse brain has learning algorithms, but it also has other stuff, which is just not learning algorithms at all, but rather innate reflexes of various sorts. So I favor the second hypothesis over the first hypothesis, but you can find papers that discuss the first hypothesis at length without ever mentioning that the second hypothesis is even a possibility. So, for example, Tony Zader's critique of pure learning is a paper that says that we have evolutionarily pre-trained learning algorithms without even mentioning the possibility that we have learning algorithms that are not pre-trained, and we also have all this other stuff in our brainstem. And if you look at the neonatal literature, I think there's good evidence that it doesn't really have much at all to do with the cortex, but is rather driven by the hypothalamus and brainstem, which are not learning algorithms. Okay, so if you right, so if you buy what I've said so far, then you wind up with this picture of the brain in which there's two subsystems. The first is the learning subsystem that has all of the within lifetime learning algorithms, and it gets horrifically complicated by the time you're an adult because you've had, a billion seconds of learning. And then there's the steering subsystem with the hypothalamus and the brainstem that contains all of your species-specific instincts, like how to vomit. And then these are interconnected to each other to inputs and to outputs. So whenever I show people that two subsystem picture, they tend to pattern match it to a lot of things that I don't endorse. So here's some more clarifications along those lines. Here's the first thing that this two subsystem picture is not. It is not old brain / new brain or triune brain. These are these like discredited theories of brain evolution from the 70s. For one thing, I'd draw the boundaries in a different place. For example, people like to lump the amygdala and the hypothalamus together, whereas from my perspective, the amygdala is definitely a learning algorithm, and the hypothalamus is definitely not. And also, both subsystems are extremely old. So lizards have both a learning subsystem and a steering subsystem. Even 500 million years ago, our like tiny worm-like ancestors had both a learning subsystem and a steering subsystem. Of course, both were much simpler than ours, but both are extremely old. Another thing that this is not is a blank slate theory or nurture over nature. For one thing, the steering subsystem has all these specific instincts in them that are playing a very important role. And also, learning algorithms have internal structure. They are not blank slates. Many of you in this room know how to program a learning algorithm. And what you don't do to program a learning algorithm is open a blank Python interpreter and say, well, I'm done. That's my learning algorithm. No, you need a neural architecture. You need learning rules. You need hyperparameters. You need a loss function, on and on and on. So by the same token, the genome has a lot of work to do to create a learning algorithm. It's not just a sponge that somehow absorbs information. And then finally, learning is different from a human is deliberately teaching me, which is what people usually talk about in the context of quote unquote nurture. For example, animals will learn to control their own bodies using internal loss functions and using reinforcement learning and trial and error. So that is learning, but parents don't have any control over that process. Another thing that this is not is a distinction between plasticity and not plastic parts of the brain. So plasticity, in terms of brain plasticity or synaptic plasticity, well, people sometimes use that term in a non-rigorous way to sort of invoke magical thinking about some animistic force that makes your brain do intelligent, adaptive things. But what it really should mean is that there are some persistent variables in the brain algorithm, and under such and such conditions, they're updated in such and such ways. So if you have a learning algorithm, it definitely needs plasticity because all of the weights need to be updated. But many other algorithms need plasticity as well. For example, if there's a counter variable that you sometimes increment by one, that would be plasticity. And there's a real example that's a little bit like this. There's an experimental result that the more that a rat has won a fight in its life, the more aggressive it will act. So that's kind of like there's a counter variable in its brain that's just counting how many fights it's won. And every time it wins a fight, the counter goes up. And when people did that measurement, they found some set of cells in the hypothalamus that that had plasticity when it won a fight. But that's not learning in the sort of learning from scratch sense. In the learning algorithm sense, it's really just a counter variable. And then the last thing this is not is some brilliant idea unknown in machine learning. Quite the contrary, every ML GitHub repository has lots of code that is not the core learning algorithm itself. For example, this is an AlphaZero clone, seeing whether it's checkmate as part of the reward function. It's just like so obvious in machine learning that people don't talk about it. But in the brain, everything is neurons and synapses. You don't have variables with legible labels and folders and all this stuff that makes the code make sense. So people can sort of fall into this trap of saying, there's neurons everywhere, so everything is a learning algorithm. Okay, so moving on to the third part of the talk. The steering subsystem is very close to my heart, and I will claim that it's the ultimate source of motivations and drives and values, and how this is related to AGI safety. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we should think of brain-like AGI as a kind of model-based reinforcement learning. So I mean this in a pretty minimal sense. There's a model, I can make predictions. I know that if I jump in the lake, then I'm going to get wet. And if I get wet, then I'm going to be cold. The model is updated by self-supervised learning, right? If I drop a ball and I didn't expect it to bounce, but it bounces anyway, then the next time I drop the ball, then I'm going to expect it to bounce. And there's reinforcement learning. If I touch a hot stove, then I won't do it again. And the model is connected to the reinforcement learning to enable planning. If I don't like being cold, then I won't jump in the lake in Quebec. So model-based reinforcement learning is a very big tent. You can probably, there's probably 500 different kinds of model-based reinforcement learning on arXiv. They're all different algorithms. They're all different from each other, and they're all different from the brain. And the details of model-based RL in the brain are something that I'm not going to get into, but you can read all about it in the blog post series. So why am I using the term steering subsystem? Well, one particularly important thing it does is to steer the learning subsystem to emit ecologically useful outputs by sending it rewards. So you touch a hot stove, and then you get negative reward, and then you're less likely to do it again. So this is analogous to how in AlphaZero, you have your RL reward function, and it steers the trained AlphaZero to behave in certain ways. If you have AlphaZero chess and there's a reward for winning, then it's going to get very good at winning at chess. If there's a reward for losing, then it's going to get good at losing at chess. So by the same token, there's something like that in your brain. And in the case of humans, it says pain is bad, other things equal, and eating when you're hungry is good. There's a curiosity drive. You don't have to train a mouse to dislike being in pain. It comes that way right out of the box, out of the womb, I guess. So if people make future AGIs using the same kind of algorithmic architecture, then they too get to choose a reward function. And what is it going to be? I don't know. Whatever they decide to put in. If you look at the RL literature today, sort of anthropologically, you'll notice that people put all kinds of reward functions without really thinking too hard about it. It's usually what's going to get me a NeurIPS paper, what's going to impress the investors, and get a high score in the game, whatever. And the default result, if you just do whatever looks cool as your reward function, is that I claim it will grow into an AGI that has callous disinterest in human welfare. So if we want to avoid that, then picking the right reward function is a huge part of solving that problem. It's not the whole solution because there's also training environment. There's also you could do interpretability, whatever. But I think that the reward function is really a big part of the solution. So again, if you look in humans, pain is bad, eating when you're hungry is good. A big one that I didn't mention is social instincts. I claim that human social instincts are upstream of all of the social and moral things that we do: compassion, friendship, spite, norm following, etc. So that's not to say that we're insensitive to culture. We do pick up habits from culture all the time, but we pick up things from culture because we want to pick up things from culture. That's incentivized by our reward function. And by the same token, there's, if you see something in culture, you don't necessarily absorb it like a sponge. If the cool kid in school is wearing pink sunglasses, then you're going to start thinking that wearing pink sunglasses is cool. But if the dumbest kid in school that you hate is wearing pink sunglasses, then you don't want to wear pink sunglasses. So this whole process sort of goes back to the reward function, even if it's also sensitive to the environment. So if we understand how human social instincts work, that could be a good jumping off point for AGI because, hey, we want our AGIs to have compassion and norm following. Not so sure about the spite and the status seeking, but at least those two seem pretty good. So we should try to figure out how they work. How do they work? So that gets us, first I wanted to just say loud and clear so that you don't miss this point, that hypercompetent brain-like AGI does not inevitably come along with compassion and friendship and other pro-social motivations and feelings. I think that high-functioning sociopaths are a great example here. They do have some social instincts, but they have very different social instincts. And yet they have brain-like AGI. They can found companies. They can do science and engineering using the same kinds of algorithmic tricks that everybody else uses. And not only that, but it's actually easier for future AGI programmers to leave out pro-social motivations. Those motivations need to be proactively added into the source code, and we don't know how. So that brings us to, how do human innate drives work? All these terms in the reward function. So that's $1 million question. And the reason it's a tricky question is that the hypothalamus and the brainstem, the steering subsystem, are kind of stupid. They don't understand the world. They don't know what's going on. They don't have any circuits for, being in debt and, for Alice from accounting, they don't have any of that in their circuitry. They're wired up to things like vomiting. But somehow the hypothalamus and brainstem are in charge of figuring out when exactly to provide ground truth reward. So how does that work? Well, here's one part of the answer. The steering subsystem has its own, too often ignored sensory processing systems. So I actually already showed that. If you remember this diagram from earlier in the talk, this red arrow here shows that sensory inputs go straight to the steering subsystem. So for example, visual information goes to the visual cortex, but it also goes straight to the superior colliculus in the brainstem. Likewise, taste has its own route to the brainstem in the medulla. Smell has this obscure necklace glomeruli route to a different obscure part of the steering subsystem, on and on with all of the different senses. Then what happens? Well, the superior colliculus has direct access to sensory information, and that's connected to a hardwired face detector. And also, I think, a detector of slithering snakes, or at least things that slither kind of like a snake slithers, and, scuttling spiders, so on and so forth. So a lot of your innate drives or primary rewards are connected to sensory inputs in this way: the smell of rotten meat, the taste of sugar, feel of pain, fear of heights. So all of those things can be wired up in the obvious way, just by processing sensory information and matching them against innate evolved heuristics. But that's not the whole answer, because, for example, think about spite. Your brain cannot calculate when to feel spite from simple heuristics on sensory inputs. It requires understanding language and situations and context that is far beyond what the hypothalamus and brainstem are capable of. So there's really a symbol grounding problem that the brain somehow solves, in the sense that there's sort of learned symbols in your cortex. That's the sort of intelligent part of the human brain, that's learning language and learning about Alice from accounting. And the hypothalamus and brainstem have to somehow figure out what's the meaning of these symbols, at least as it pertains to triggering innate reactions. So this has been the main research program that I've been working on for past 3 years or so. I do other stuff too, but this has been a major research interest of mine. And I think I've made some progress, especially with this recent blog post called Neuroscience of Human Social Instincts, a sketch. You can Google search it. That sort of catches up with where I'm at right now. I wind up believing that there's this long and somewhat convoluted story. It's not terribly elegant. It has a lot of ingredients, but I claim that all of the ingredients in the story are things that are definitely in our brain, that correspond to neuroanatomy in a specific way that makes sense evolutionarily, things that have homologies in mice, things that are related to famous reactions like orienting to a loud sound. Anyway, so it starts with these innate sensory heuristics, as I just mentioned, but then those are used as ground truth for a bunch of supervised learning algorithms in the amygdala and elsewhere. And then the learned content of those algorithms is sculpted by learning rate modulation and something that I call involuntary attention. And then this eventually leads into a way for the hypothalamus and the brainstem to detect and process what I call transient empathetic simulations, where it figures out that I'm thinking of a different person who is angry right now, for example. And then if you wire those up correctly, you can wind up with compassion and spite and status seeking and so on. So this is a sketchy outline. plenty more work to do, even if I'm on the right track. Okay, so then what? Are human social instincts a jumping off point for AGI? Well, slavishly copying them into an AGI is for sure a terrible idea. One reason is that normally human social instincts are combined with growing up in a human body in a human culture at human speed. And, feral children do wind up pretty messed up. So the human social instincts are not enough if you don't spend any time thinking about training environments or, adjusting for that. And also, of course, human social instincts leave something to be desired. I don't want my AGI to have bloodlust and teenage angst and status seeking. But if it's a jumping off point, then okay, let's jump off of it and start thinking directly about brain-like AGI. What should the reward function be? What should the training environment be? So on and so forth. That's what I've been pondering since writing that post a few months ago, and I got my work cut out. I don't have any good plan for brain-like AGI, but so it's if anyone else wants to work on it, there's still plenty of important open problems. We don't have a good plan. I hope nobody invents brain-like AGI before we come up with one. So in conclusion, yeah, if people invent brain-like AGI, it's going to be a very big deal. Certainly the best or worst, probably the last thing that will ever happen to humanity. But there's technical work that we can do today to increase the odds that things go well. So thank you for listening.